Hello everybody, welcome to this University of Sheffield Brockhoff lecture. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Henk de Burg. I'm a professor in the School of Languages and Cultures and one of the two directors, together with Evgeny Dobrenko, of the Brockhoff Center, which has organized this lecture series. Our speaker today is Peter Pomerantsev, and we're very honored to have him. Peter Pomerantsev is a leading expert on information manipulation. He is the author of two best-selling books. First, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, which explores the new Russia with its nouveau riche, its criminals and professional killers, its supermodels and its various wheeler dealers. Second, Peter's second book, This Is Not Propaganda, which was published last year. Both books are pretty brilliant, I have to say, so highly recommended. Peter's talk today deals with the use of disinformation as a weapon with fake news, dark advertising, internet bots, and computer hacking. Now, as most of you will know, I always tell a little joke before handing over to the speaker. So here goes, a little joke about the power of disinformation and preconceptions. Let me say, first of all, as a sort of very short introduction to the anecdote, there exists a particular view about the Russian national character. It's a preconception, a prejudice really, and yet people fall for it again and again. So, President Bill Clinton and then President of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin, are in the sauna. Yeltsin says, and I shan't do the Russian accent, Yeltsin says, you know, we Russians, after we've been in the sauna, we immediately take an ice bath. That's how tough we are. So they get out of the sauna, and Bill Clinton, not wanting to look like a pussy, jumps straight into the ice bath. Yeltsin cautiously dips his toe into the icy water, says, oh, much too cold, and immediately goes back into the sauna. So, that's a little bit about disinformation, but by no means on the level and the subtlety of Peter Pomerantsev's lecture. And with that, I will hand you over to him. So, Peter, take it away.
Hi, it's a huge pleasure and a privilege to be here. Actually, this university is in my latest book. This Is Not Propaganda. It's the one with the unicorn. One of the heroes of the book is a former Islamist who, during the 1990s, would come to this university. He's from Sheffield. There's actually a lot of Sheffield in the book. And propagandize the need for political Islam and how Muslims would never feel at home in England. And he was a leading ideologue of Hizb ut-Tahrir, who kind of laid the narrative foundations for ISIS in their idea of promoting political Islam. So there you go. We're already inside the book before we even start. Thank you very much for that introduction, which made me sound very respectable. I now also work at a university which is sort of respectable. I don't know. Ish. I'm at the London School of Economics, where I run a small research initiative that looks at kind of disinformation campaigns and what we can do about them, and I'll come back to that later. But actually, I have to say, just so you understand a bit more about myself, and so I don't kind of try to pretend to be something that I'm not. Firstly, I'm not an academic. I'm a kind of lapsed TV producer, and when I started my journey through adulthood after I left university, I probably did the most kind of least respectable, most sordid and morally corrupt thing that you can possibly do if you have a nice degree. I went and made reality shows. And to make it worse, I went and made reality shows in Russia, which I came to around 2001. So just as a year into Vladimir Putin's rule. Reality shows are an amazing way to try to understand really the social preference of a society. Actually, mass entertainment is a very good way of understanding what people really like, and it's a very good form of sociology, I find. But and I would quickly find out that sort of, even though the Russia I'd come to seemed very similar to the West on the surface, there were there were sort of political parties and plural media and all this sort of veneer of democracy. It was a society which did have some different values. So the company that I worked for, one of the shows that it had made in Russia was The Apprentice. The Apprentice is a reality show which some of you, I'm sure all of you are aware of, yeah? Sort of Donald Trump did the one in the US, Alan Sugar did the one here. And it's actually a reality show that has proven very important politically in America. So the company I worked for, they made the Russian version of it, which was very well made, sort of the way it's done, sort of Western consultants come over and sort of help make the show. Very well cast. They had a real oligarch, Vladimir Potanin, in the sort of Donald Trump role. And like Donald Trump, he's an actual sort of tycoon. And, it was all beautifully made, but it did very, very badly in the ratings. And part of the reason we thought was this is not how Russians thought you made money. It didn't feel real to Russians. The idea that you'd have a brilliant business idea and then get rewarded for it, like you have in The Apprentice, that seemed alien in a culture where, to make money, you had to be a corrupt bureaucrat, or through extortion, or through any of these kind of crooked ways. And so The Apprentice didn't work. Other reality shows worked very well in Russia. Survivor, when you put a bunch of people on a sort of desert island and they have to survive. Russians love those shows. They were like, oh, this is our culture. You take people, you put them in an isolated place, you torture them. It's the Gulag, we know this. And it did incredibly well, and it's still going. But during my time in Russia, and the reason I mention it now, because I was working in TV, I sort of got to observe sort of what seemed to me a very sort of innovative and strange propaganda model, which I try to describe in my first book, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, which was an attempt to kind of sum it up in one phrase. It was a propaganda model where the regime wasn't trying to so much convince you of something as just to seed doubt and seed uncertainty, and gives you the sense that you lived in a strange world where truth was unknowable, where, well, you could never really know what was going on. And it was a world where communism wasn't sort of celebrated as an optimistic future of some sort. Instead, it was kind of ideology-free. It was sort of bathed in nostalgias and a desire to bring Russia off its knees, but without any kind of clarity about where it was going. And kind of political language and ideology seemed to have come apart. So there was a liberal democratic party, but it was neither liberal nor democratic. There was a communist party, which were kind of orthodox nationalists with social programs, but they weren't communists, really. And so all the language you use to describe society seemed somehow weirdly amorphous, as if words had been disconnected from their meaning. And there were elections, but they were kind of completely sham elections. And there was a plural media, but it was all controlled from the center. So, things didn't seem to really have the meanings that they were assigned by language. And perhaps most strangely was kind of a whole generation of politicians. I mean, Putin, but he was kind of above politics, but I mean more within politics, who didn't really set much value by facts. I mean, this whole idea that you could sort of catch power out by the truth and find the evidence that showed their corruption, they just shrug. We don't care. We don't care about your facts. Or if anything, some of them, or some of the most successful ones, kind of revel in spouting absolute nonsense in kind of this sort of carnivalesque approach to language. And so at the end of my time in Russia was around 2011. I left, and then I wrote my first book, and kind of ends on the thought that, well, the West is messed up in so many ways, but at least we have politicians who value facts, who sort of try to argue through the use of facts. And we have a clear political distinctions of left and right, and political parties mean something. And we don't bathe in nostalgia. We have a normal, coherent debate about the future. And then lo and behold, 2016 happens. And so many of the manifestations that I'd seen in the Russia of the early 2000s emerge here, both in the Brexit debate, in the Trump election, but also in various sort of movements throughout Western Europe. And I caught myself feeling a kind of deja vu. I called like my Russian friends, a lot of whom had left Russia to live in London and America. And I was like, am I imagining it? Are these some of these characters very Russian? And they're like, no, we have the same feeling as you do. Like, it's coming here. And really, for my second book, I was kind of personally impelled by that question. Why did the future emerge first in Russia? Is it systemic? And if it's systemic, what do we do about it? Is there any way to still cleave by these kind of ideals that were nothing more than ideals, but were still present in culture about, an evidence-based debate, influencing our political processes, and all this kind of stuff that we're meant to be aspiring to. So, in order to do that, the second book isn't about Russia, even though Russia kind of stalks its pages. But it's one of these round-the-world books. So it goes to Latin America and South Asia, and Europe and America and Ukraine, and Sheffield. And it's an attempt to make sense of that. Is there a pattern underneath these things that we're seeing? But in order to kind of make sense of the present, I found myself going back into the past to see what had changed from the 20th century. How is the 21st century different from the 20th century, if at all? And actually, in order to do that, I found myself going back into my personal story, my family story. So my connection with Russia didn't start in 2001. It started much, much earlier. So my parents are Soviets. They were born and lived in the Soviet Union. And I was born in the Soviet Union, even though I left when I was 9 months old. But I started looking at my parents' story. And so the book is a very strange book, and it's purposefully strange. It moves between family memoir and kind of a mix of journalism, sort of interviewing a lot of spin doctors and propagandists across the world, bits of academic analysis, and bits of high-minded speculation. But to give you a kind of a sense of the style, I thought I'd read a little bit from the start. Not that I want to bore you. I know it's a bit of a cop-out when lecturers read stuff. But just to give you a sense of the book, because what we're going to start talking about are things which are quite heavy on the theory side. But I don't want you to get the wrong impression. This is a book of stories, and it's meant to be it's meant to be read like a story. So I'll just read you a little bit from the beginning. He came out of the sea and was arrested on the beach. 2 men in suits standing over his clothes as he returned from his swim. They ordered him to get dressed quickly, pull his trousers over his wet trunks. On the drive, the trunks were still wet, shrinking, turning cold, leaving a damp patch on his trousers in the back seat. He had to keep them on during the interrogation. There he was, trying to keep up a dignified facade, but all the time, the wet trunks made him squirm. It struck him they had done it on purpose. They were well versed in this sort of thing, these mid-ranking KGB men, masters of the small-time humiliation, the micro-mind game. Why had they arrested him here, he wondered, in Odessa, not where he lived, in Kiev? Then he realized it was August, and they wanted a few days by the seaside. In between interrogations, they would take him to the beach to go swimming themselves. One would sit with him while the other would bathe. On one of their visits to the beach, an artist took out an easel and began to paint the three of them. The colonel and major grew nervous. They were KGB and weren't meant to have their images recorded during an operation. Go and have a look at what he's drawing, they ordered their prisoner. He went over and had a look. Now it was his turn to mess with them a little. He's not drawn a good likeness of me, but you're coming out very true to life. He had been detained for distributing copies of harmful literature to friends and acquaintances, books censored for telling the truth about the Soviet Gulag or for being written by exiles. When one interrogator would leave, the other would pull out a book of chess puzzles and solve them, chewing on the end of a pencil. At first, the prisoner wondered if this was some clever mind game. Then he realized the man was just lazy, killing time at work. After 6 days, he was permitted to go back to Kiev, but the investigation continued. On the way home from work at the library, the black car would pull up and take him for more interrogations. During that time, life went on. His fiancée conceived, they married. At the back of the reception lurked a KGB photographer. He moved in with his wife's family in a flat opposite Goloseevsky Park, where his father-in-law had put up a palace of cages for his dozens of canaries, an aviary of throbbing feathers dancing against the backdrop of the park. Every time the doorbell rang, he would start, scared it was the KGB, and would begin burning anything incriminating: letters, samizdat articles, lists of arrests. The canaries would beat their wings in a panic-stricken flutter. Each morning, he rose at dawn, gently turned the Spadola radiator on, pushed the dial to shortwave, wiggled and waved the antenna to dispel the fog of jamming, climbed on chairs and tables to get the best reception, steering the dial in an acoustic slalom between transmissions of East German pop and Soviet military bands, pressing his ear tight to the speaker and, through the hiss and crackle, making his way to the magical words, "This is London, this is Washington." He was listening for news about arrests. The nets closed around his circle. Grisha was taken to the woods and roughed up. Olga was accused of being a prostitute and, to make the point, was locked up in a VD clinic with actual prostitutes. Geli was taken to remand prison and refused treatment for so long that he went and died. Everyone prepared for the worst. His mother-in-law taught him a secret code based on sausages. If I bring sausages sliced right to left, it means we've been able to get out news of your arrest to the West, and it's been broadcast on the radio. If I slice them left to right, it means we failed. It sounds like something out of an old joke or a bad film, but it's nevertheless true, he would write later. When the KGB come at dawn and you mumble drowsily, "Who's there?" they often shout, "Telegram." You proceed in semi-sleep, trying not to wake up too much, so you can go back to a snug dream. One moment, you moan, pull on the nearest trousers, dig out some change to pay the messenger, open the door. And the most painful part is not that they have come for you or that they got you up so early, but that you, like some small boy, fell for the lie about delivering a telegram. You squeeze in your hot palm the suddenly sweaty change, holding back tears of humiliation. At 8 a.m. on the 30th of September 1977, in between interrogations, their child was born. My grandmother wanted me to be called Pinchas after her grandfather. My parents wanted Theodore. I ended up being named Pyotr, the first of several renegotiations of my name. 40 years have passed since my parents were pursued by the KGB for the simple right to read, to write, to listen to what they chose to, and to say what they wanted. Today, the world they hoped for, in which censorship would fall like the Berlin Wall, can seem much closer. We live in what academics call an era of information abundance. But the assumptions that underlay the struggles for rights and freedoms in the 20th century between citizens armed with truth and information and regimes with their censors and secret police have been turned upside down. We now have more information than ever, but it hasn't only brought the benefits we expected. More information was supposed to mean more freedom to stand up to the powerful, but it's also given them new ways to crush and silence dissent. More information was supposed to mean a more informed debate, but we seem less capable of deliberation than ever. More information was supposed to mean mutual understanding across borders, but it's also made possible new and more subtle forms of conflicts and subversion. We live in a world of mass persuasion run amok, where the means of manipulation have gone forth and multiplied. A world of dark ads, psyops, hacks, bots, soft facts, deepfakes, fake news, ISIS, Putin, trolls, and Trump. So, I hope that wasn't too long. The reason my family story is there is not because of sentimentality, and it's not really a classic memoir. I just use this memoir about the 1970s, 1980s, because their story kind of continues through the book. Because within that, you have a concentration of the assumptions, formula, axioms that underlay what we thought would entail a democratic information space. So in that little excerpt there, you already have the battle for freedom of expression against censorship, most obviously. My father being arrested for handling censored books and the battle for that. You have pluralism, the idea that we've had lots of different media. It would mean that we had a healthy and robust debate. Think of him trying to listen to the Western radios censored in the Soviet Union through the fog of Soviet jamming. He had kind of an idea of the free individual, the liberal reader, who could read what he wanted to and most probably could say what he wanted to, and a certain lifestyle and a certain cultural set of attributes that went with that, listening to rock and roll or jazz or modern art. And I think sort of swimming within that, you have the sense that you could speak truth to power. I mean, why else would they be trying to censor truth quite so viciously? They seem almost afraid of it. And kind of there are metaphors that we've always used that captured it, something like, I don't know, the idea that we should live in a marketplace of ideas, that we've had lots and lots of information, the best information would come to the top through some market theory of rational choice. Now, all of that has been put into question in a very, very systemic way. So does the marketplace of ideas metaphor really hold an era when you can churn out so much disinformation at the click of a button that you just swamp society with so much disinformation that people can't tell truth from fiction anymore, and they just end up lost and confused and cynical, and often reaching to strong men to guide them through this murky world? And what happens when pluralism tips over into factionalism and partisanship and polarization so vicious that people can't debate each other anymore, that they live in separate realities and don't recognize the arguments of the other, or at the very worst, the humanity of the other? And even kind of in a more subtle way, when we express ourselves online, you can express ourselves all we want on Facebook. But the more we do so, the more of our data and our self-expression is then given to data brokers and given on from them to spin doctors who can use it to target us in various ways, kind of researching our attitudinal and behavioral patterns in ways that we might not even be aware of. So even that link between self-expression and emancipation has become very uncertain. And of course, this incredible phenomenon, which I first glimpsed in Russia, but now we can see everywhere, of what happens when the powerful don't care if they're caught out with the truth. What if they just shrug? What if they say they don't care? That's very hard for all the journalists I know, which is quite a lot. That's most of the people I know. There they are sort of screaming the truth at politicians, and there's just no response. Not only do the politicians not care, whatever, the public doesn't care. Their voters don't care. How do you do journalism in that sort of environment? So in the book, I try to investigate the reasons behind this. And I think a part of it is to do with technology, which is sort of the obvious thing to look at. I actually start the book in the Philippines, where I look at the way the regime is using cyber militias and online trolls to attack critical journalists. These sort of locust infestations of massed social media accounts accusing critical journalists of being fake news or being disloyal or actually being paid by sinister global conspiracies, undermining trust in them. That's very important in the Philippines because the Philippines has, or did when I was writing, I don't know if it's still true, had the highest use of social media per head of population. It's a very social media-tized society. It plays a huge role there. And this undermines, these kind of attacks undermine faith in the journalists, and they then pave the way to kind of legal attacks, so, tax inspections and all that stuff. But without first breaking trust into the government critics, the other stuff couldn't happen. And whenever sort of the journalists that I interview would sort of tell or appeal to the general public or to the government saying, hold on, this is an attack of the government onto us. This is weirdly a form of censorship. We're being silenced through all these attacks. The government spokespeople say, no, this is freedom of expression. This is what you guys always fought for, you Democrats. Here it is. This is just concerned citizens online expressing their point of view. And however cynical that argument might seem, legally it's completely correct. There's nothing in Article 19 of the Declaration of Human Rights, which is the article that helps protect freedom of expression, the right to receive information, and the right to express your opinion. There's nothing in there about disinformation. Disinformation doesn't exist as a legal category. And we see these kind of online militias and cyber armies used across the world in authoritarian regimes and hybrid regimes and democracies. And the people who face these onslaughts, they have no legal or philosophical arguments with which to respond. And something I look at a lot in the book as well is what's has become known as polarization, which is not a word that I like very much. Simply because what's wrong, debate and polarization are good for society. Polarization in and of itself is not a bad thing. I think what we're talking about here is a very strange paradox that we see in a lot of countries, in Britain and America, something that my colleagues at King's College call affective polarization, emotional polarization. And it's the paradox that we're in where, actually, if you go policy by policy, minority rights, the economy, et cetera, our societies aren't very polarized at all. Actually, quite a lot of convergence. Some issues, climate change, for example, there is much more distance, but nothing that can be resolved through debate. Sort of the opposite of the 1960s, when you had ideological polarization, genuine one, about civil rights, about communism versus capitalism. Here now you have the opposite. You have actually quite a lot of convergence in policy issues, but really high emotional, affective polarization. So maybe you see people just screaming at each other. And there's been a lot of kind of research that shows that facts don't seem to break through in this environment. And I think the way social media incentivizes certain types of behavior has helped to fuel this sort of polarization. So, when you go online, you're looking for likes and shares. Yeah? You're looking for a little ego boost for your place within the group when you make any kind of statement or any kind of self-expression. And the easiest way to do that, as group polarization theory has shown us over many decades, take the most extreme positions. So you're always looking for the most extreme positions in order to reinforce your position in the group, to reinforce a certain kind of identity. There's plenty of research at Yale by Daniel Kahan, which shows that whenever you have an environment where facts come into conflict with your identity, even highly educated people reject the facts. So social media seems to be incentivizing and fueling certain types of sort of cognitive behavior. So that's the technological side. I don't think it quite explains everything, though. Partly because the manifestations I already saw in Russia in the early 2000s, that was a pre-social media era. It'd be lovely to blame everything on Mark Zuckerberg, but I don't think that quite holds. And especially doesn't quite hold for this kind of generation of politicians who don't seem to care about the facts. And so once I get beyond the kind of technological part of the book, I try to work out what's happened culturally that makes facts less worthwhile in political discourse. And I relate it back to the Cold War, which is another reason why it's important to have sort of this memory story in the book. So in the 20th century, you have two systems, communism, democratic capitalism, which both claim, for better or worse, to be rational Enlightenment ideals with a purportedly clear version of the future that they're claiming to achieve. And the language or the imitation of factuality and evidence is very important in that discourse. And politicians lie all the time. That's part of the job description. But you have to sound serious because, you're representing a serious, objective, rational theory. And you're proving that you're achieving a future. You're presenting evidence to show that you're achieving it. I think that's the key, this association between a rational future that you're claiming to achieve and the language of factuality and evidence, and a sort of science-y ring to it. I think if you look at what all these sort of so-called populist leaders have in common, whether that's Trump, our own little round Trump here, Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Zeman in the Czech Republic. I mean, you can go on and on and on. They don't really have an ideology in common. They're ideologically actually very, very different. Or they don't really do ideology. They just pick and choose different, whatever works. But they're all nostalgists. None of them have a rhetoric of the future. And I think that's very, very important. The casting away of factual language comes at a time when all universal projects about an attainable future have fallen away. And kind of that makes sense, because, facts are not very pleasant things. I mean, facts tell me that I have to take the 9 p.m. back to London and then get up at 5 o'clock for a 6 a.m. conference call tomorrow. I mean, it's not very pleasant. Facts tell one that one is overweight, that one is, putting together vast amounts of student debt that one will never pay off, that essentially that one is going to die. So facts are not very pleasant. I mean, why on earth should politicians who are trying to appeal to you do facts? But facts are useful. They're useful if you're trying to build something. If you're building a bridge, suddenly even Donald Trump has very, very evidence-based language. You have to prove that you're going to do it, what you're going to do. I realize the bridge metaphor falls down with Boris Johnson because he comes up with crazy bridges, but generally, if you're trying to establish some version of the future, you need evidence to show you're getting there. And I think what happened in the Russia of the 1990s, and certainly when I'd got there, was all kind of dreams of the future fell away. I mean, the Soviet version of the future probably hadn't been believed in by many, many people for the last decades of the Soviet Union's existence. But even that kind of burst of democratic utopianism at the start of the 1990s, really by the mid-90s, it starts to fall away for many reasons. Disastrous reforms and social cataclysms of many types. And nostalgia starts to sort of overtake the political discourse. There's a beautiful essay about the rhetoric of nostalgia by Svetlana Boym, who's a very, very good Russian-American sort of literary critic. She sort of traces how political rhetoric at the start of the 90s began with utopia and optimism in Russia, and by the end was all nostalgia. And when I arrived there, sort of the main story is bring Russia off its knees, which sort of pre-echoes Make America Great Again. And our own versions in what we know, what we used to think of as the West, our own notions of kind of a common idea of future progress, they don't fall away so dramatically. There's no kind of dramatic cliff edge, but they kind of whittle away like an old bar of soap through the crisis of 2008, which sort of undermines the idea that a certain economic model is going to make us all happy. I go through lots of examples in the book. I don't think there's one. I think there's lots of moments. And it's not the same for everyone. Lots of people still feel that there's a wonderful future awaiting them and their children. But there's enough people who don't. And therefore a politics and a rhetoric of nostalgia and of a rebellion against factual language becomes appealing. So what are we going to do about it? So I set up this small research initiative at the LSE to kind of address that problem. We're about 4 people, so we should have this all sorted by Christmas. But I think there's 2 things to think about. I actually do think regulation has a role to play, which is the debate we're in at the moment. I don't know if you've been following this at all. I actually should have asked you what you all study, because maybe you're all sort of physics majors, and all this is very probably esoteric for you. But there's a very big debate in the parliament at the moment about how we regulate the internet. There's a very big debate in Europe. There's one brewing in America, but America's too chaotic for anything kind of coherent to happen at the moment. And in lots of other bits of the world. How do we regulate the internet? How do we tame it? I mean, there's now an understanding that we live in a new environment. So the way not to regulate it is probably the way a lot of democracies are trying to at the moment. We're trying to regulate content. So in the face of these cyber militias and all these troll armies and this mass disinformation campaigns, the instinct is often, okay, let's start to regulate content. Let's start to sort of stop this lie and take that down and punish the companies if they don't take down this piece of idiocy said by this one person. I think Sajid Javid, who at the time was Home Office Minister, the presentation of the white paper on online harms, which is going to be the main kind of push to regulate the internet in Britain, talked about how he wanted to save children from the monsters of the internet. And his main focus was on what he called user-generated content. This won't work. This makes a very naive mistake of taking the regulation we had for broadcasting, because we do regulate broadcasting, and moving it onto the online space. I mean, so obviously we have a regulator, Ofcom, that regulates news on our main TV channels, where it has to be, you can make a complaint if the news you feel is not accurate and balanced. I mean, I would love to regulate some of the stuff that my in-laws write on Facebook. I would love to go like, Ofcom, let's not make this gendered, my person-in-law wrote some nonsense on Facebook, take it down. I mean, it's a ridiculous idea. I mean, user-generated content online is nothing like broadcasting. It's like regulating conversation in a pub. It's also probably illegal. So any attempts to do this, I think, will just hit international human rights legislation and lose. I think we have to think about regulation in a much cleverer way. So I think back to my father, he was surrounded by censorship around content. That's what he didn't have enough of. Nowadays, even people who live in authoritarian regimes have a lot of content. In Russia, there's still, compared to the Soviet Union, there's really very, very little censorship. You don't have to sort of put your ear to the shortwave radio and try to find 2 seconds of Western news. You can get it online at any moment you like. The problem isn't that. In a way, we're surrounded with a different form of censorship. In the sense, we don't understand how the information environment around us is being shaped. We don't understand whether something we see online is my person-in-law or is a bunch of actually completely fake, engineered accounts launched by the Filipino regime or by Putin or by Dominic Cummings, to give the illusion that lots of people are saying something, but it's not actually people. It's bots, trolls, cyborgs, avatars. The mass-coordinated deception campaigns. But the deception isn't the content. The content can be neutral. Content can be, I don't like you, or I don't trust you, or Trump is great, or Bernie is gay, whatever. Actually, that is untrue. But you know what I mean? The content itself doesn't really have to be disinforming. What's disinforming is the behavior. I'm not talking about individual anonymity online, which is fine. People need to be anonymous online for all sorts of reasons, from security through to bashfulness. There's no problem with one person being anonymous online. That's fine. The problem are mass campaigns pretending to be organic, but which are actually engineered and deceptive. So I would make that kind of mass deceptive behavior illegal. I think we can legislate towards that. And that actually taps into the right of the citizen to understand the information environments around them. I think that's very much inside the spirit, and I'd like to think inside the letter of the law of freedom of expression. I mean, that's just the first step. I mean, I mentioned very briefly that, we're in a situation now where the more you express yourself online, the more it allows your data to be kind of weaponized against you, either by advertising, which I don't find too frightening, or by political campaigns. We should know and understand which of our own data is being used to target us and why. So whenever we see an ad during a campaign, we should understand why they're sending it to us. Which bits of my own data are being used to influence me? Are the same sort of ads being sent to the person down the road? We need to imagine an empowered citizen who understands, with as much 2020 vision as possible, how the information environment around them is being shaped. I'm aware you want to ask questions. I'm looking at the time. It's just me sort of keeping an eye on the time. I'm going to give myself 2 more minutes, and then I'll loop you in. So I think that will probably mean public oversight of algorithms, and we can think through the consequences of that sort of position. It gets very complex at one point. But that, I think, should be our ideal. And then people can start to actually interact with the information around them as equals. That's the sort of legislation that the Putins and the Xi Jinpings of this world will hate, because they don't want their own people to know how they game the algorithms, how they use bots and trolls to create the illusion of support for various things online. So that would be a very stark difference between a democratic internet and a non-democratic one. But most importantly, that would then clear the way for what I think we really need, which is a new type of media that starts to negotiate the challenges. So that's what we experiment with at the LSE. We work with sort of small independent media usually, and we haven't worked in England. Worked in Ukraine, worked in Italy. Hopefully we'll do some work in Hungary. Thinking about how does a media reach the audiences that are currently alienated. So not how you just G up your side, which is how most media works for many reasons, but how do you actually bring together this lot over here and this lot over here who've been pushed aside in a very concerted way by propaganda. That means thinking about what kind of values they have, what kind of common things move them, what common traumas they might have. So trying to understand more about audiences and create media which has that aim, which has metrics that measure what kind of effect it has. So that would be effect beyond likes and shares, that measured whether the content produces trust, whether it produces a more civil and less toxic conversation, whether it helps to spread factual discourse. And if we buy into my really rather speculative idea that the facts and the future are deeply associated, then I think that might be a kind of a mission for this sort of media. Not just to bring together, find commonalities, but to foster conversations about the future, which is easier said than done. But it's possible. It's possible in the sort of topics you decide to cover. To give you a small example, and I'll end on it. We have these debates on in America, which many of you are probably watching, the Democratic debates. So those debates could easily have been formatted and created by a reality show producer. Okay, I'll do one last aside, and then I'll end. So when reality shows started, the first Big Brother, the first Apprentice, us TV producers, we had a problem. People collaborated. They got on. They were nice to each other, because put into a hard situation, people they started helping each other out. And TV producers were like, oh my God, this is terrible. And so we cast characters who are scandalous, who weren't good at collaborating, and we engineered situations of conflict. And we got good ratings. Compare The First Apprentice to The Apprentice now. It was actually people genuinely trying to do sort of problem solve. And now it's just a freak show of kind of hysterics. Today's debates, in America, try to select the Democratic candidate in the primaries. The way they're structured is, if you attack somebody else personally, they get 30 seconds to answer. If they attack you, you get 30 seconds to answer. So your whole motivation is to attack each other like in a reality show or Punch and Judy show. The whole thing is structured that way. And surprise, surprise, somebody who has a background in reality shows did really well. You could build them in a completely different way. You could, this is an idea from Catherine Hall Jameson at University of Pennsylvania, or a version of her idea. Give them completely different motivations. Say, here's a policy problem that we need solving. Show us how you're going to collaborate with each other in order to solve it. Show us how you're going to use your policy teams in order to solve it. So you've put them in a completely different environment, not one where they're attacking each other in increasingly absurd ways, but where they're actually having to talk about the future, show how they're going to achieve something, show the results that they're going to reach, how they're going to reach them, which should push them towards a more evidence-based, a more fact-driven conversation. That's just a tiny example. But we need to be able to think about that across a whole range of media.